We see them everywhere, every day. Trees. But when was the last time you thought about their beauty or the impact they had on our lives, on life itself? Harriet Rix is a tree science consultant. She holds a degree in biochemistry from the University of Oxford and an MPhil in the history and the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. In her book, The Genius of Trees, she reveals the inventive ways trees sculpt their environment. Good afternoon, Harriet. So I have a very simple question to begin with. What is the genius of trees then, Harriet?
The genius of trees, as I explain it, is the way that they use biochemistry to shape the world around them. So whereas we might think of them as passive objects that sit there and sort of, are deeply rooted, actually, because they can do such amazing things chemically, they can shape the world around them so that they're creating a niche for themselves and, by extension, for us. But their genius, as I explain it, is this way that they are using a sort of embodied evolutionary action to shape the world around them, rather than the way we use it, which is to, for us, genius is to recreate a world around us or to search it out. And for them, genius is to shape the world biochemically in a way that allows them to live and flourish.
Genius implies that there is some sort of consciousness, so this makes the title of your book very captivating, because you start imagining trees of being like a thinking object that has the ability to reflect itself. But that's not what you're saying. The genius comes from another level.
Yes, exactly. And the trouble is that when you start to talk about genius or use these words that we would use for humans, you start to anthropomorphize trees. And of course, the way that they do things is so much more creative than, or so different from the way we would apply genius to a human. But we don't have any other word for what it is that they do. So to try and evoke this idea of a superhuman complexity and a really complicated way of manipulating, kind of minutely manipulating the world with, and there's this phrase, genius is endless patience, that the idea that you are tweaking all the time to get to the level of shaping of the world that you really want.
I learned a lot while I was reading your book, and I also started to think about life as such in a different way, because when we think of how life started, most of us will probably say it's somewhere in the ocean. Many years ago, life started microscopic ways with bacteria and so on, but that's not really, well, of course life started there, but you say that when life moved on terrestrial soil, that was a second major step in the evolution of life itself, right?
Yes, and I think one of the interesting things about that was because there was this struggle with UV light, which hadn't been such an issue before when we were protected by ocean. You ended up, or plants ended up, with this very interesting, very structural background, which, we think of our skeletons, and they obviously are incredibly important to us, but for a tree, its structure is so fundamental. It's so, and it makes it a tree. The fact that it had to protect itself made it this huge, imposing object that is sort of almost like a stone. It's so resilient.
Yeah. And it shaped the surface of the earth as well. I mean, before that, I never thought about that before. Actually, it was rock. It was solid.
Yes.
And then suddenly something happened, right?
Yeah. For me, that was one of the amazing things when I was doing my research. I went to upstate New York to the Albany Museum, which is this great kind of, you can visit it. It's very exciting. If you're ever in New York, just pop up on the train. And it's this great, it looks like it's landed from outer space. Governor Rockefeller constructed it as a sort of vanity project. It's a great concrete bunker. But inside, the fossils that they have of the earliest fossil forests show really clearly this transition from the bare earth that was incredibly shattering and dangerous, and yeah, I hadn't realized the earth was so bare before trees started grinding it up. I hadn't realized quite how much it was just dust and torrents and a mixture. And of course, without trees, there is no soil.
Like you said, there were torrents everywhere on the earth back then, and also trees helped tunnel, well, all that that liquid that was out there.
Yes, exactly. And I think what is so interesting is if you go to a very high mountain, you feel that early earth. You know, you're feeling, if you're up at the top of the Alps, or I don't know if have you ever climbed the Matterhorn?
Climbed the Matterhorn? No. Did you?
But I feel that when you're up on a high mountain, that is what it would have been like. You know, these great shattering bits of scree and huge torrents coming down, and every bit of rain just lands straight on the rock and runs off it, whereas trees were creating essentially tunnels down to the aquifer and creating this level of sort of pacified water that is quite hard for us to comprehend in lowlands now.
You also explained that 66 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Earth, which had a major impact on the evolution of trees. We all think about dinosaurs, that they died back then when that happened, of course, but we usually don't think about trees, that they also underwent a major evolution because of that asteroid hitting the Earth. What happened then?
Well, you can still go and see the crater where the asteroid hit, and it is an amazing thing. But what happened was that the dust from it spread across the whole of the Earth. There was a sort of nuclear winter. There was a winter for 2 years caused by all the dust blocking out the sun. And what was so interesting for trees was that the revolution that occurred was from them becoming conifers, which were from the domination of conifers. So pine forests, fir forests, and things like monkey puzzles were very dominant. Suddenly, what happened was more flexible trees, which we would now think of as, you know, the ash, the oak, the beech trees, became. They were given their chance, and so they managed to sort of spring out from under the canopy of the conifers and take over. And the other result of that was that big forests like the Amazon and the European temperate forests that we know now became sort of incredibly productive, and you got these very mixed forests with lots of different canopy layers, and so it had an incredible effect, because yes, we think of the dinosaurs and it wiping out the dinosaurs, but to a certain extent it also wiped out the conifers, and we think the conifers are with us now, but in a sense they're like the birds are to the dinosaurs. The conifers we see are a tiny remnant of the huge conifer forests that there used to be across all the world. And that is an amazing thought, to think that the oak at that point was just sort of crawling around in the undergrowth. And the other thing about that was that suddenly pollinated trees, so plants which were flowering plants which had previously just been these tiny niche plants under the conifer overgrowth, became much more important, because they could manipulate insects and force them to kind of, or not force them, but encourage them to find new niches for them.
But it also gives us hope, right? That, well, in times when we talk about climate change and environment being under threat, that trees manage to overcome even the worst obstacles that they might be. So apparently they're very able to adapt to the most difficult circumstances.
Yes, exactly. And I think because human-generated climate change is happening so fast, trees are having a real problem keeping up. So we see lots of tree diseases, we see lots of deaths of trees, and that's because they can't reproduce quickly enough, really, to adapt to the climate change that we're seeing at the moment. But the very interesting thing is that they have this incredible flexible DNA, which can be much more flexible than ours, because if we have a tumor or a problem with our DNA, that can be disastrous almost immediately. For a tree, it can have very different DNA from its parents and still thrive and do incredibly well. So in a way, they have this superhuman ability, this genius ability to reshape themselves to fit to the climate that they're experiencing. And in an oak tree, for example, this will happen in the acorn. So as the acorn germinates, you'll have this incredibly clever way of it adapting to how much water there is or what the temperature is. It's not infallible, but it's brilliant, and it does give us hope.
Harriet, you're a tree scientist. How did you become a tree scientist? It's a very exceptional job description, I'd say.
Well, it's a wonderful thing to be. I think more people should do it if they feel like it. I studied biochemistry, but I was working mainly on viruses and immunology. And I started to work a little bit at the laboratory in Kew Gardens, which is a big botanical garden in London. And I enjoyed it. I was amazed by tree immunology, by the way that trees produce chemicals which can, kill an insect, kill this insect, but encourage this insect. I thought that was so clever, this targeting, this really wonderful tweaking. And so I became more and more interested in trees. I was helped by a family background. My grandparents had had a tree nursery for generations, a very little tree nursery. And so I then became more and more interested in the biochemistry of trees. But of course, that doesn't make you a tree scientist, because trees are at their most brilliant when they're growing and old and gnarled and sort of, they're at their most brilliant in the way that we see them, I think. And so I was thinking about how I could be an ecologist or, what I could do. And I had a call out of the blue, how I could earn some money, frankly, from trees, because it's not that easy. You can be a tree surgeon or work in a lab, but I didn't want to work in a lab. And I took a slightly odd course, which was I was asked to go and work in landmine clearance in the Middle East. And I did that. I found it very interesting. But I realized then that the environmental destruction of war was it became so impossible to regenerate anything in the absence of trees that I then went back to work for a tree charity. And now I describe myself as a tree scientist, because to call myself a biochemist implies that I'm working with humans, and I'm not at all anymore. I'm only working.
Do you have a favorite tree?
Ooh, it's tricky. Yes. In Iraq, you have these trees called Valonia oaks, which are like the oak trees we know in Europe, but they have these wonderful mannerist leaves. And actually, on the front of my book, that leaf at the top is the leaf of my favorite tree, the Valonia oak. And they have huge acorns, and people in Iraq eat the acorns a bit like we would eat chestnuts, or people in Europe might eat chestnuts. And they are just so adaptable. They can be coppiced and form little short shrubs. They can form these great gnarled trunks which grow over anything. And you see them regularly just sort of eating rock. And I think they're just the most amazing trees. So beautiful.
In your book, you also take us on a journey through different forests and areas the world over, and I found very interesting how you described a holiday island I've been to, La Gomera, and I wish I had read your book before I went there a couple of years ago, because I would have gone through the forest with different eyes. So what's the special thing about this Canary Island that you've been to?
Well, because it's stuck in the trade winds, because it's a little island which is getting these warm winds off the sea, it can shape, the trees on it have managed to hang on where all the similar trees around them have been lost. So I don't know, did you have a favorite tree when you went there? Do you remember?
I remember the moss, like well, you go through a foggy environment and have.
Yeah.
I'd say the trees aren't very tall, they're very low, but they're covered with moss, and I found that, and it's hanging there. It wasn't just on the trees themselves, but the moss, and they were interconnected, well, through, I don't know what it is, some green, looked like algae actually. but it just felt so unique and special, which is also why I picked this example. It felt like an otherworldly experience walking through that forest where you wouldn't expect it when you're coming up from a very rocky environment, which is sunburned and very dry, and then you go up in the mountains and it was a completely different space.
Exactly. And I think what's so brilliant is because you're walking across this island, and it's a very small distance, really, you see this extraordinary change, which is that the trees that hang on there are remnants of a much warmer, hotter climate. But because they were well established and because they had this moisture in the air to play with, they managed to create a cloud forest out of essentially nothing. So as you go up the mountain, I'm sure you felt the change in temperature, and you go from a parched desert landscape into this very high, very cold, very damp, really unpleasant in some ways environment. And you can actually, if you look up, you can see the trees sort of milking clouds. You can see this pearlescence on the leaves, and then it runs down and it goes into the moss, it nourishes the moss, and it has created and sort of maintains this amazing forest in a place which otherwise would be incredibly hot and dry and inhospitable. It would be much more natural in a sense for it to be like that, because had there never been trees on that island, you would have the trade winds just coming up and over, and I think you would. It's very unlikely that you would have foliage there. It's very unlikely you would have that cloud. But because you have this combination of the warm, wet wind, and these amazing trees with their emerald leaves, which you would find in cloud forests in South America, but of course here you're on the other side of the Atlantic, you're miles and miles away. And there's a lovely thing, which is that Christopher Columbus set off from the port of La Gomera. I'm sure you knew this, yeah. But when he got to the other side of the Atlantic, he would have found these incredibly similar trees, which again were remnants of this warmer, hotter, wetter climate. And the trees that hung on in La Gomera managed to keep that climate for themselves, managed to carry on creating the niche that they wanted in the world.
Do we cherish trees enough? Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
do we cherish trees enough? I mean, are we aware of their importance for our lives? What do you think?
I don't think we do, because I think we take them for granted. It's very hard to generalize, but I think people often both underestimate and overestimate trees. So they assume they'll always be there because they look so hard and stiff and massive, and then and often something like debarking. People are very uncareful often about the bark of trees, so they're very happy carving their name in trees and so on. And of course, that's very unlikely to destroy a tree. But I don't think people treat them with enough understanding of what is really going to affect them. So nitrogen in the air can cause terrible problems for trees, and that's something that we don't see, so we don't really feel it's a problem. And I think it's wonderful the way that people appreciate trees when they actually think about it. So I think if most people stopped for 5 minutes a day and looked at a tree, they would definitely cherish them enough. But as it is, there's a feeling that they're like us, but lesser. Whereas actually they're totally different from us, and I think much greater.
I'm also asking because there are parts in the world where you don't have many trees. I've just recently been to Iceland, where there are major reforestation efforts underway, because hundreds of years ago there were many trees on the island, but they were all chopped off by the Vikings to build ships and so on. And also in the Middle East, where trees, they are cherished because they mean life to the people living there. So there you can experience a very different attitude towards trees, right?
Yeah, and I think one of this 3rd of August, I think, marks 11 years since the Yazidi genocide, and one of the real tragedies there was that, along with the genocide of a people, the Yazidis, there was also terrible deforestation, and so trees, which were really the lifeblood of a community and a real focal point for small villages, were chopped down by ISIS. And I think that happens all too often, and then it becomes incredibly hard to put them back, because trees will create a niche for themselves. They'll create a way that they can grow, and so once you've chopped that down, you change the entire environment, and it becomes incredibly hard to re-establish trees. I'm very interested to hear about Iceland. I didn't realize that at all. But yeah, I think in the same way that the Bedouin used to plant oak trees along their migratory routes because they provided this very important resource in kind of hard times of year, and in the same way, people in Europe did that as well. They planted trees to sort of mark spots and so on.
But it's a simple truth that trees will be here on Earth when we're long gone, right? As humans.
So. Or at least, and I find this a very hopeful idea. I think this is a wonderful thing. But I don't know, how do you feel about that?
The same, actually. I'm not a very spiritual person myself, but I feel some kind of spirituality when I'm in nature, when I see mountains and trees, because that is a very comforting thought for myself as well, to imagine that all these things will be there and we become part of it again at one point, and I find that very, very comforting, actually, this idea.
Yes, and because they have such a connection, no, connection isn't the right word, because they have this stolidity, I think that also makes it a very helpful idea. There's this idea that cycles can come and go. It's a bit like art capturing a moment. Trees capture a moment, but they also have a living cycle within them. And so that combination is very reassuring. It can be very, very nice, isn't it?
Harriet Rix, it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for your book, for your time, for your efforts.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for lovely questions.